today. And again, thanks to TIE Atlanta for the opportunity to partner on this event this year. We are very excited about our partnership with TIE. We're at kind of an early stage with it, but it's just a wonderful organization and we're glad to be a part of it. And when I look at some of the opportunities that we have ahead of us, the chance to engage with some tremendous entrepreneurs in our community is very exciting to us. And hopefully you guys will walk away with some nice insight here that will help you as you advance your businesses. I think this virtual event is a perfect example of that. I mean, you mentioned many of these have gone virtual. We're all having to work in a virtual world here, but we want to make sure from Fifth Third that and our partners that you're still getting content that's very beneficial to you and how to navigate the world we live in today. I also want to thank our partners who've been with us as we've put these on each year. I want to thank our guests that have joined us on the call today from Veracor. Those of you that have joined from Carr, Riggs & Ingram, CPA firm, thank you for joining. And our guests from Aprio as well. I'd like to say thank you all for joining. This has become a big event each year for us, and we're really excited to, quote, tie it in with TIE Atlanta as well. So thank you. Thank you to Barry Hyman, Adrian Grant, Richard Kopelman, members of my advisory board who are part of those companies, and want to thank you again. You know, this is an interesting time as we think about what's happening in our global economy. And so I'm really excited about with Jeff and his kind of insights as to what's going on both in the global and macro world, but also kind of this important time of the year as we face election and uncertainties. I think Jeff will do a really nice job of kind of tying in all of those aspects and addressing any questions you may have. But the complexities around that, our job is to try to bring you insights to help make it as simple as we can for you. We know a lot of things have happened, a lot of things are currently happening, and a lot of things are going to happen very soon that are going to have a lot of impact. So thank you, Jeff Korzenik, for joining us. Jeff, as I said, is a great to have with us. Featured speaker many times on CNBC, often highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and other publications. He's a sought after thought leader in this space, and we're really excited to have him. So Jeff serves as our chief investment strategist for Fifth Third Bank, where he's responsible for the overall bank's client investment strategy for all of our customers. Spent over 30 years in this business and is a tremendous thought leader and a dear friend. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. I'm also equally excited to bring to you Jim Canfield. Jim is obviously a very outgoing speaker and very passionate about the work he does with CEOs. He's spoken to over 250 groups and has connected and had discussions with over 5,000 CEOs and other executives in key business concepts over the last couple of years. So we're going to be real excited. It's a nice treat to have Jim join us as well. He's the author of CEO Tools 2.0, How to Think, Lead, and Manage Like a CEO. And he will be discussing many aspects of that with you today. And lucky for all of you, you will receive a copy of this book. And I'd like to thank Aprio, along with Fifth Third, for bringing that gift to each of you. So you will get a chance to dive even deeper into Jim's book. And I can't wait to learn more about it as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Korzenik. And Jeff, tell us all we need to know how to navigate these waters.
In 15 minutes or less. So
yeah.
20 minutes or less. Well, I'm delighted to be back with the group, if only virtually. Wish I could be there in person. Let me start out with a little bit of context, and I think this is an important facet of this current business cycle. There's a message that the market is sending us in the way that the S&P 500 has rebounded, and we want to show by contrast what happened in 2008-09. The blue line is the performance of the S&P 500 indexed to the market peak preceding the 08-09 downturn. This is in some ways typical of what you have to go through a recession and a recovery and eventually expansion period. Recessions traditionally come about in the United States and in other economies because you have fundamental imbalances in the economy that have to be wrung out and new equilibrium levels have to be found. And that's a slow and painful process. In 08, 09, of course, we had an excess inventory of housing and we had too much leverage in the financial system. So if you look at the performance of the S&P 500, that blue line, it took a full year to wring out all those excesses and bottom in the market. And then it took several years to recover from all the damage done in the wake of those imbalances being addressed. This episode in our economic history is very different. And we see again the S&P 500 performance indexed to the pre-recession market peak, this time the green line for our current experience. And you'll see, yes, a very dramatic, very painful downturn, but also a very rapid recovery. What the market is reflecting is the fact that we did not enter this with fundamental economic imbalances. And so in theory, if we could address the medical concerns, or once we address the medical concerns, we'll be able to resume a high level of economic activity. Now, it's true, the S&P 500 is far from a perfect proxy of what we can expect in the market, and it doesn't reflect what's going on today. Markets are inherently forward-looking. The traditional pattern, and one we believe will be replicated again, is stock prices recover before earnings fully recover. Earnings recover before GDP fully recovers, and GDP fully recovers before the labor market fully recovers. So we, on the ground, will have a lot of improvement yet to go, but much of this is already discounted in the stock market. But the key here is that we don't have these fundamental imbalances that necessarily require us to have a long, drawn-out, painful period. Now, there are damages being done to the economy right now. We'll talk about those that are going to slow some of our growth. Some of that has already started, but we think fundamentally that's an important distinction. The other distinction is the way that the economic cycle was interrupted this time around by government intervention. Traditionally, economies spiral downward in a recession through a loss of liquidity. Then you have pressures on businesses and insolvencies. That results in layoffs, which results in our consumer-oriented economy in a downturn in consumption. And this can spiral and represent a vicious circle. But we've had very rapid interventions on the part of the federal government, both monetary policy through the Federal Reserve, as well as fiscal interventions. And in each case, they've helped interrupt, not completely eliminate these problems, but at least to mitigate them. We've actually done a lot of cushioning relative to the size of the problem. One of the reasons and one of the truly exceptional aspects of this economic cycle is not just the fact that there was monetary and fiscal intervention, but the extraordinary size of it. You have to measure the size of interventions relative to the overall economy. So we look at fiscal stimulus as a percentage of GDP. Take a look on the far left-hand column here. This is the experience of the Great Depression, starting in the late 20s and through the mid 30s in this measure. For all we read in our high school textbooks about the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration and all those interventions and fiscal stimulus of the New Deal, the reality is that over the entire period, those interventions added up to 5.7% of GDP. 08, 09, we were off to a little bit of a slow start. In 08, 1% intervention. 09, we had gotten more interventions and a big fiscal stimulus in place, 5.5% of GDP. But look how that contrasts to what we've put into the economy in just a matter of months, 13.5%, interventions at the level of 13.5% of GDP. And whether it comes this week or has to wait till after the election, it's very likely there's another stimulus bill that will probably add up to another 1 or 2% of GDP intervention. So this is a very, or actually about a 1%. This is a very significant and really unprecedented level of fiscal response. In a sense, we were fortunate to have had the experience of 08, 09 in that we were faster to the mark and able to deploy strategies of fiscal spending, of monetary policy very quickly this time around. And it's obviously that this has helped. We look, this is, I think, one of the most significant charts you can ever look at in a business cycle. That's the rate of unemployment in the economy. And again, let's go back to the Great Depression. That's the left-hand side. In these charts, you'll see vertical gray shaded areas or periods of recession. And you'll see towards the left, you have a very extended, broad period of recession. And unemployment rates soared to 25% in the Great Depression. But it's not just how high unemployment gets, it's how long it persists. That's a real measure of the damage being done to the consumer and to your economy overall. Starting in the 1930s, we had a decade-long period of double-digit unemployment. It did extraordinary damage to the workforce. When you're doing damage like that to the labor force, it's got to show up in very poor and structurally challenged economic growth. Take a look now, contrast that to our current experience with a very severe cessation of economic activity due to the lockdowns, both voluntary measures as well as mandates. And unemployment did go soaring. Although unemployment, the official unemployment measure was only about 14%, the reality is it probably got higher. There's a measurement error that the federal government has readily acknowledged. People who were on furloughs self-reported as employed, even though they were technically unemployed. The federal officials have gotten their arms around this now, and the current measure of 7+ % is probably an accurate representation. But the reality is our unemployment rate, properly accounted for, probably got up in the range of 18%. So a very severe level, but because of the fiscal stimulus, because of the monetary stimulus, we got back to more acceptable levels for a recession of unemployment very quickly. And that's given the economy quite a bit of momentum. But ultimately, we are held hostage to a degree to medical outcomes. And we do have to keep in mind that although an economy at this point in the cycle recovered from the bottom, adding jobs, should have sufficient momentum to just keep going until you run out of room to grow. This should be the start of a multi-year long expansion cycle. We still have to be cognizant of medical risks. Now, we've all become armchair epidemiologists, so everything is subject to change. But we think from an economic perspective, the most important measure is hospitalizations. Because if you think back to the spring, it was the potential for our hospital systems to become overwhelmed that was the inspiration or the motive behind shutting down the economy. And if we are going to see a significant slowdown ahead or a reversal of some of our gains, it will likely be because of medical conditions. Now, the first spike here, the first peak in hospitalizations in the spring was predominantly New York City. About 40 to 50% of those hospitalizations were the New York area. And so you had a huge number of hospitalizations due to COVID-19 in a very confined geographic area. To try to flatten the curve, push out those infections to a broader time frame so we don't overwhelm the system, we implemented a number of changes that of course cost us a tremendous amount in terms of the economy. Then as the economy started to open up again, we got another increase in hospitalizations. But this second peak in July and August was of a very different character. This was not very much present in New York City, but it was spread around the other parts of the country. So from a individual hospital system, it was not a terrible stress. There were a few pockets here and there where hospital systems were stressed, but we saw nowhere near the danger of overwhelming hospital capacity. And we think it's likely that we will not get to that point again. It is true that hospitalizations are rising. It's interesting, there has been a decrease of fatalities per hospitalization. So we're getting better at treating this. But more importantly, this is spread around the rest of the country. Hospital system, by and large in the US, has not only good solid capacity, they've built some more and they have flex capacity. So this is something we're keeping an eye on, but is not anything that we can envision forcing a new downturn in the US economy at this point in time. And hopefully we will have a vaccine in place. We get the data on the left-hand side here, tracking vaccine progress. You'll see there are 6 vaccines that have been approved for early or limited use. These are in China and Russia by and large, so we are not sure that they are in terms of efficacy and safety are ready for prime time elsewhere on the planet. But we have a lot of progress being made in the US. It seems likely that we may have something available as early as year end or early into the new year. But then we have a challenge of distribution. The first vaccinations are likely to occur in healthcare personnel, perhaps the very elderly, and it will take a while simply to get to the point where we don't have to worry about health. But we have lesser worries about health than we once did because we've made progress in treatment, antiviral drugs, antibacterial drugs, fighting potential follow-on infections, experimental things being tried like plasma treatments, and those improved fatality statistics for hospitalizations are likely the result of improved treatment protocols. So all of this is good medical progress that is helping eliminate the risk of a renewed downturn in the US economy. There is a seasonal factor, and it's often referred to as a second wave risk, and it's real. We believe that there is seasonality to this, if for no other reason than colder weather will force more people into indoor spaces. This has been very typical of diseases of this kind. But there is, in our opinion, at Fifth Third, undue fear over a second wave risk that is based, at least in part, by our previous major pandemic in the United States, which was the great influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. That's really our best historic precedent for what we're going through today. And that was indeed a very deadly pandemic rather. 650,000 Americans died of the Spanish flu as that influenza was known. And globally, it was devastating. 50 million people, according to the CDC, are believed to have died of the great influenza over that time period. It came in 3 waves. The second wave was by far the most deadly, and it came in the fall of 1918. So people see a lot of parallels and parallel risk. But we push back hard on that risk. You have to take into account that we've had 100 years of medical advances. Many died of the Spanish flu due to follow-on bacterial infections, and no antibiotics had been developed at that point in time, just to give one example. Critically, the historic context of the times was quite different. World War I was still going on when the second wave began. Try practicing good hygiene and social distancing in a trench in France. And then even when the war ended, when the armistice was signed famously on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, you then started a number of what we would think of today as super spreader events as troops moved home across the world. Tightly packed troop trains, troop ships helped spread the Spanish flu around the world to deadly effect. People have often remarked that, yes, but in those days we were a more rural society and had less risk from this. That is true in aggregate, but not true in the sense that our cities at the time tended to be much more densely populated. For example, the borough of Manhattan, the most densely populated borough of New York City, had 1 million more residents in the 1920 census than today. So people lived in those cities, in many cases, in tenement housing, multiple generations living together, sometimes challenges of plumbing and sewage that made for less hygienic conditions, all things that we know tend to breed a spread of diseases like this. And then finally, one other spreader event, of course, is public transit. Interestingly, public transit ridership in the United States, not just in terms relative to population, but in absolute numbers, public transit ridership in the United States peaked in 1926. We are a more car-oriented society. It allows us greater flexibility in maintaining social distancing. So yes, rising infections are likely coming with the seasonality of diseases like this, but will it be devastating and force us into another economic downturn? That is not our base case. But there is damage being done. And we have to take account of some of the structural problems that we are developing in the US economy. The one that is most on our mind is what's going on in the labor force. And we're particularly concerned about the potential for rising long-term unemployment. Long-term unemployment is a technical term. It's defined by economists as being unemployed for 27 weeks or longer, roughly 6 months. Economists focus on that number because once you get to the 6-month mark of unemployment, bad things start to happen in terms of one's ability to regain a job. We know from all sorts of consistent studies, once you've hit that 6-month mark, the longer you are out, the harder it is to regain a job. The longer you are out, the more likely that if you do get a job, that job will not stick. There's a very tragic history of people who've been long-term unemployed, finally landing a job, and then only to be unemployed within months afterwards. If you do get a job, the longer you've been out past that 6-month mark, the lower your compensation is likely to be relative to what you were making before your period of unemployment. And then critically, and this did a tremendous amount of damage to the economy in the wake of the last Great Recession, we have found that increasingly long-term unemployed tend to drop out of the workforce for good. Why are we worried about this today? Well, if you look at the middle of the chart, you'll see the modern peak in terms of long-term unemployment. That was in 2010, the wake of an aftermath of 08, 09. Roughly 45% of those unemployed had been unemployed for 6 months or longer, long-term unemployed. And since then, you've had a combination of people regaining jobs and really quite a bit of people who've dropped out. We think we lost probably 1 million or more workers due to the lack of ability to re-enter a job. And then, of course, it hasn't been a problem more recently. And if you go back just a few months, 3 months ago, the percentage of those unemployed who are long-term unemployed was only 5%, then 12%, and now we're at 19%, which was pre-pandemic levels. Why are we concerned? Well, if you look at how the pandemic and the impact on layoffs has unfolded over time, a tremendous amount of layoffs occurred at the very end of March and through the month of April. If those people who suffered layoffs during that period have not regained their jobs, add 6 months to April, you're into October. And so we believe that October employment releases, which are coming in a few weeks, the first week of November, will start to reflect a dramatic rise in long-term unemployment. We think it will exceed the levels that we saw in the wake of 08, 09. And this is going to be very difficult for the economy to grow by being able to bring people back into the workforce. We're seeing other areas of damage done in the labor markets. The last 2 months have had a very disturbing trend of women dropping out of the workforce, 35 to 54-year-old women. Our conjecture at Fifth Third is this is related to children at home who are not going physically to school, are learning online, and are too young to be left unsupervised. So this is a big concern for the labor forces as well. All of these are going to slow growth going forward and limit our ultimate growth. Another disruption through the pandemic, of course, is election, because odds have changed. Prior to the pandemic, our base case would have been an unchanged balance of power. President Trump would have retained the White House, the Republicans would have retained the Senate, the Democrats would have retained the House. That is probably the outcome which would create the least change in terms of change to business policies and to investment performance. We would have expected, if this does indeed play out, we would expect further deregulation by the executive branch, and then given a split Congress, the only policies you agree on are ones with bipartisan support: infrastructure spending, reshoring of manufacturing jobs back to the US. In the earlier parts of the pandemic, it looked like the Congress would remain split, but increasingly has looked likely, according to polls and betting markets, that Vice President Biden will take the White House. But without control of the Senate in this scenario, this is case number 2, You probably get executive branch orders undoing some of the deregulatory moves by the Trump administration. And again, you're constrained to areas of bipartisan agreement for legislation, infrastructure spending, reshoring, different flavor than Republican-led initiatives. These would be led presumably by from the White House, and but still generally along the same lines. But if you were to look at the betting markets today and the polls, the most likely case is this blue wave, where we see a Democratic sweep of both houses of Congress as well as the White House. And this opens the door for legislative action. Atop of the agenda is likely to be higher taxes, some rollback, about a 50% rollback of the corporate tax cuts, some higher marginal corporate tax rates, numerous changes. The most dramatic one, we think, in terms of impacting investment markets and potentially impacting some economic outcomes, would be the proposal that is on the Democratic Party platform to eliminate favorable treatment of capital gains. They'd be taxed at income tax rates. That's a big shift from past policy. We think could cause a lot of volatility. We'll also see volatility, if this is the case, that plays out specific to sectors of the market: energy, healthcare, financial services. This creates winners and losers, but in aggregate, these different policies tend not to have a huge impact on GDP growth, nor on aggregate market performance. Now, taxes can change that. Higher corporate tax rates will obviously hurts earnings per share, after-tax earnings per share, and changes a little bit of the mix of who has the most beneficial tax treatment. Things like energy, you see alternative energy companies favored over traditional fossil fuel producers, for example. So there's certainly volatility, but it doesn't change that much the economic direction. A capital gains tax rate hike of this type being mentioned, and we only say it's being mentioned. I tend to think that while it is on the party platform, it would get tempered in actual legislation. But if it isn't, that could be something that, in addition to creating near-term volatility as people sell assets, appreciated assets, to capture lower capital gains this year, it also does tend to discourage capital investment to some degree. But there's still room for bipartisan agreement. For those of you who remember the word bipartisan: infrastructure spending, reshoring of manufacturing. Let's keep in mind the long view here. No matter who wins the election, we are in a recovery and expansion period. And barring any medical disaster that forces us to go backwards in terms of economic growth, we've reset the clock. Whereas once we were running out of capacity to grow in the economy, we were pushing up against industrial capacity. We were certainly pushing up against a full labor market. We now have ample labor and ample industrial capacity. That is the backdrop for a long and sustained expansion. The chart you see before you, the gray areas, again, periods of recession. The blues are the blue shaded areas, how much has been shaved off of GDP during those periods. But take a look at the expansions, the white areas and the green mountains. Yes, recessions are incredibly painful, but we outgrow them during periods of expansion. That's been the historic performance. That's what we would expect again today. But the post-pandemic economy is going to be somewhat different. We'll get through the medical issues. We'll get through whatever policy disruptions are coming. But we still are going to have some changes. We tend to view changes wrought by the pandemic not as whole new directions, but as changes that were already in place, or trends that were already in place that got supercharged. Policy, industries, geographies, even employer-employee relationships, and we think a very positive one that I will end on eventually is reshoring of manufacturing. Start with policy. There's a new Fed monetary policy framework in place. This was rolled out at the last meeting of the FOMC last month, and by Fed Chair Powell during his remarks after the meeting and press conference. It's a big break with the past. Our Fed, our central bankers, have two mandates: price stability as well as full employment. They have chosen traditionally, when they're focusing on price stability, to define that as getting inflation to 2%, not above, not substantially below. And so in the past, they've approached this with the thought and the messaging that a 2% inflation rate will force the Fed to raise interest rates from these zero levels, normalized interest rates. The new policy framework says there's something to be gained by letting inflation run above 2% for an extended period. They, moreover, want to focus on returning the labor markets to full employment. They're defining that as 4%. So the statement is that the Fed, the new policy framework is, the Fed will tolerate inflation above 2% for, using their words, an extended period, and does not intend to start raising interest rates until we return to full employment, which they believe will be around 4%. That means rates are longer for lower. There is a nuance here. And the nuance is, if there's a Democratic sweep, there may be a third mandate added to the Fed. There's already legislation in the House of Representatives which would require a third mandate to make the Fed responsible for addressing income inequality and racial inequality. It's not something that's particularly well suited to monetary policy, but Fed Chair Powell has focused quite a bit, and you're seeing actions by the regional Feds talk as well about the role that red-hot labor markets can play in addressing some of these imbalances and inequities in society. So again, we would think this will influence monetary policy. It's not lower, just lower for longer. Its red-hot labor markets are likely to persist for periods we haven't seen in the past. We already are seeing big changes to the education industry. A lot more to come. I think we're in the early stages of this and finally starting to capitalize, truly capitalize on the potential for online learning. A lot ahead there. We're not sure what form it's going to take, but it's important to start keeping that in the back of your mind. And for entrepreneurs like this audience, there are going to be great opportunities there. Spending from home, online e-commerce has been a long established trend. It goes back at least 2 decades quite visibly. But look how it accelerated on the right-hand side. There are 2 takeaways, not just the this affirmation that the pandemic is a supercharger of trends, but look at the level that we've achieved. It's only about 16% of all retail sales or e-commerce sales. There's a long, long way to go. One thing that I believe is true about the pandemic is we've broken through some ceilings that are going to make the path, even though we'll go back to shopping in stores, but I think we've opened up new ground in high ticket items. The plural of anecdote is not data, but I can tell you many anecdotes from clients and customers of the bank who have bought vehicles sight unseen online, who bought homes sight unseen online. So these kind of high ticket items that had once been thought not to be suitable for e-commerce are today considered possibilities and will certainly be growth areas in our view. Working from home, we are all very, very familiar with it. We don't have a lot of data. This is a study commissioned by the Department of Labor of the state of Oregon. It's one of the few studies we could find. They believe that we will have probably peaked at about 25% of workers who worked from home. Again, a trend that was slightly in place, now accelerated. Yes, we'll retrace some of that, but we'll see hybrid models as well as a lot more workers working from home. If you can learn from home, work from home, spend from home, that's got to have a lot of implications around the economy. To take just one example, transportation, I'll contrast. We've got a couple of measures here. Upper left is public transit ridership. This is obviously severely impacted. It will get better, but it is unlikely to achieve its peaks, we believe, for some time. Part of the problem here is that when you have lower levels of public transit ridership, you tend to get cutbacks in service. When you get cutbacks in service, it becomes less attractive to ride public transit. That, coupled with work from home trends, we think is going to be a huge challenge. Contrast that with the lower right, auto sales, snapped right back. Unlike above it, Uber ridership, unlike to the left, passenger miles. We have long been a car economy. I think that got reinforced by this pandemic. People can also move. if you're less tied to being close to an office space or to a campus, we already had a trend of millennials moving from the urban core out to the suburbs. That has accelerated, again, supercharged by the pandemic. It's not just people, it's companies. This is a survey done by the Site Selectors Guild. It's the Trade Association of Site Selection Professionals. They're not recommending companies build up or move to large cities anymore. Mid-sized cities and the suburbs are the winners in their view. People are also moving. We see some trends in the types of geographies they're choosing. U-Haul tracks growth states. They rank all 50 states by the most likely to see inbound U-Haul traffic. Where are people moving to? Topping the list, Florida. Bottom of the list, as I sit here in the city of Chicago, is Illinois. And there are some trends visible. The Southeast is a beneficiary in general. Warmer weather, generally warmer weather states benefit, lower tax states benefit. High tax and cold weather seem to be towards the bottom of this list. We think that trend will continue and probably accelerate as people feel more comfortable moving about. We already had seen trends in place of challenges of finding talent and retaining talent. The chart on the left is a tenure measure. Tenure is, of course, critically important to labor-intensive industries. You not only have to attract employees, you have to keep them. When you lose them, work is undone. You have recruiting costs, you have onboarding costs, and you lose productivity when you can't keep engaged employees in one place over time. And some of the workforce where we had seen success isn't working in the post-pandemic. Over 65 workers have health concerns, working parents have childcare concerns, and then we've long studied the needs of marginalized workers, people, for instance, with criminal records or low history of work in their past. All of these workers, if we're going to get them, are going to require much more comprehensive wraparound services than employers on average have been offering. We think it is coming. We think it is demographically destined. Birth rates in the United States have been declining since the millennial peak in 1990. They are now 40%. Birth rates in the US are 40% below the millennial peak. Coupled with the Fed's desire for red-hot labor markets. Red-hot labor markets are coming. We think employers have to be focused on talent acquisition, talent retention and development, even while we have a fairly high unemployment rate today. Okay, let me end on two slides that are fundamentally good news for the US economy, and I think very good news in particular for states like Georgia that have a strong manufacturing base. The first thing to understand about the opportunity for reshoring, bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, is that there is a prevalent myth that is demonstrably untrue, that we lost manufacturing in this country because technology replaced those jobs. Technology has always been replacing jobs in manufacturing. We have a 200-year history of technology replacing manufacturing jobs. But that history also shows that the wealth gained by those productivity improvements of technology create demand for more goods, which requires net more manufacturing jobs. Take a look at the chart on the left and that boxed in area, roughly 2000 to 2010. This is not number of jobs, this is market share of manufacturing employment. If it was technology alone, we would not have expected to see a big disruption in our market share. Sure, numbers could have gone down, but not market share. Clearly something else was at play, particularly when you take into account that over this period, we lost about 5 million manufacturing jobs in the US. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is absolute numbers of manufacturing employees across the globe. The globe gained 35 million manufacturing jobs, even as we lost 5 million. The jobs didn't go away, they just went to other countries. And they went there because it was cheap, primarily to China and elsewhere in Asia, as well as somewhat to other countries. But the economics have changed. We get data from the Boston Consulting Group's Index of Manufacturing Competitiveness. This is indexed to the US. So by definition, the US is 100 in this index of cost. Numbers below 100 mean it's cheaper. Numbers above 100 means it's more expensive to manufacture. If you look on the chart at the right, the first 5 bars there are the biggest export countries. These are where there's industrial capacity by and large. If you were going to send jobs abroad, these are places that could absorb some of those jobs. And you'll see that only China among these major export countries is still cheaper than the US. And it's really not that much cheaper anymore. This was the end of 2019, excuse me. And it was about 5% cheaper on average than the US. That's probably narrowed to 2 or 3% because of the changes in the value of the dollar. And now we have a bipartisan agreement that we should be looking at this, trying to move the supply chain away from China or less dependence on China, particularly focused on areas like healthcare goods, for instance. The dollars appears to have peaked, and that could add. We still have challenges, infrastructure. We've lost industry clusters, critical mass in certain industries. And there aren't really the opportunities to send to that many cheaper places. If you look on the far right-hand side of the countries tracked by the Boston Consulting Group, these are the 5 cheapest manufacturers. Nowhere is cheap in the way that China was cheap back in 2000. And many of the countries that are cheap, like Malaysia, Indonesia, you don't even see Vietnam. They no longer make the cheapest list. Those are countries that have much more limited capacity. India, in theory, should have lots of capacity, but they've struggled to take advantage of that for decades. Maybe this will be their day in the sun. We don't think it's all coming back to the U.S. We just think that the U.S. will have its fair share. And the reason we have to care about that is, even if we're not going back, we certainly don't believe we're going back to 1948 America, when half of all jobs were in manufacturing. But every job we add in manufacturing has an outsized impact on the economy. Economists talk about multiplier effects. In manufacturing, every dollar of value add in manufacturing is associated with 3 times as much gains for GDP. Every job in manufacturing historically has been thought to add 3 other jobs in the economy. Today, economists believe that this traditional 3 multiplier is way too low, and that manufacturing actually has a multiplier effect somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 times. So it's extraordinarily important, and it's a really good opportunity for the US economy over the next decade. With that, I'd be delighted to take some questions if we have time.
We are right there at the time, Jeff, but I did want to ask one question, because we did have one come in through the chat when you were presenting, and then we'll go right into Jim. What is your view on the residential foreclosures, and once everything opens back up? One of the things that we've looked at in other presentations is the impact that the subsidy of unemployment has had on effective income for people. And if people were eligible for unemployment, that $600 per week subsidy actually meant that in many cases they were making more than they had made while actively employed. And although that subsidy is now down to a $300 or $400 subsidy, we think some stimulus is coming which will sustain that. So for people who are eligible for unemployment, and that's not everyone, this has been an incredible, frankly, a windfall that should help cushion some of the damage to the economy. We had a record high savings rate in the economy as a reflection of that. There's more stimulus coming. I think the damage done will not be anywhere as near as great as you would think from the high level of unemployment. Over time, though, it is, we've flattened the curve of damage done, I think is what this will be. Over time, though, if people have been incented, as some have, to not return to a job, the bottom decile of earners made 3 times as much through the subsidy and unemployment as they had through working. If that kept people from going back into the job market, and then they become long-term unemployed, and then they can't get back in, we're going to have problems down the road when those subsidies and when unemployment ends. But we flattened that curve. I don't think anything catastrophic in those areas. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks again for breaking things down. There are a few more questions in the Q&A. So as Jim is going on, I know that you can access that and actually type in the answer as well. But for the folks that have asked, we'll definitely send you guys a response. So I think now, Jim, and I think we're going to probably go till 2:30, just as a heads up to everyone. But Jim, all you, go ahead. You're on mute, sir.
Yep. Can you pin me to the full screen? Yep.
All right, so my content will be best viewed if you go to the upper right of my picture. There's 3 little dots and say pin to screen. Okay, you've got me set up perfectly for that. Great. So look, what a great macro view of everything we're dealing with at an economic level and some of the impacts that will have on our businesses. Just amazing. Thanks so much for that, Jeff. That was really instructional and informative. I want to drop down to a micro level. How do we run our businesses better? How do we lead, run, manage, grow? In some cases, maybe even save our business. At Aprio, we've been talking to our clients about 3 key areas to focus on for the upcoming year in 2021. Number 1, people. Who, what, when, and where are going to make the things happen that you really need to see happen with your business in the upcoming year. Number 2, planning. Planning for very specific strategic initiatives, directive objectives that will give you a chance to understand where your business is headed, how you'll make that happen. And then last, look, profits. We don't think profits are something you just leave behind at the end. They're something you plan for. And these 3 elements, if you look at those in the upcoming year, are going to be absolutely essential. For my time today, I'd like to focus on people. The people in your organization that are going to make it happen in 2021 or not, and what we can do to ensure that they come through for us in a big way. Well, one of the things I've learned about people, every single person that works for you, every single one from the top to the bottom has 3 questions on their mind. They want to know the answers to 3 things. Where are we going? How am I doing? And number 3, how can I help make things better around here? To the extent that we can address these issues in our businesses, people get more aligned, more engaged, and therefore deliver better results. To the extent that we don't, people become disenfranchised, disillusioned, and frankly don't deliver as strongly for us. Let's break these down one at a time as we look at some really great tools that can help you deliver outcomes in each of these 3 key areas. Number 1, where are we going? I'm going to break this down even further. The one message every leader needs to send to their organization and to their team on an ongoing and repetitive basis is, where are we headed? How are we going to get there? And what are we tracking to know when we're on and off track? This is the essence of creating alignment. Every single person has to know where we're headed. Then more detail, tactics, how are we going to get there? And last, what metrics are telling us if we're on track or off track? The other part of keeping people aligned is a reliable cadence of communication. Think about the major parts of every year. And think about how in the upcoming year, you're going to send the messages you need to send to keep your people fully aligned and subsequently engaged. So annually, we need to give the big picture. Where are we headed? How we're going to get there? And then what we're tracking. Once a quarter, we want to break this down at a strategic level, taking a look at a review. Here's where we said we were going. Here's how we've done so far. Here are some areas that are working, some places where we're gaining some traction, things we're happy about. Here are some areas where we still have some challenges, where we have some opportunity to create growth and change, where we need help from others to help get us there. Every month, we want to break down the metrics in detail. This is that, what are we tracking? Now I'm going to point out something obvious that you probably noticed, but let me point it out. Every time I've said, where are we headed? What are we going to do to get there? And what are we tracking to know when we're on and off track? I've always said when we're on and off track, not if. You see, the reality is most of the time we're always off track. We're a little ahead or a little behind, or a lot ahead or a lot behind. The only circumstance I see working with hundreds of CEOs is the one that shows them exactly where they thought they would be, delivering the exact result they expected at the exact time they expected it. This just doesn't happen very often. And when it does, that moment is fleeting. One of the key responsibilities of a leader is course correction. Quickly understanding when we're ahead, when we're behind, staying ahead when we're ahead, and getting back on track where we're behind. Metrics are the way to do that. They will tell us when and where we need to make changes in the organization to drive the results that we want. Now we get down to every week. How do we focus on those key actionable outcomes that deliver the results and goals that we've laid out? How do we make sure that people are doing what it takes on a day-by-day basis to get the results that we need? And then every day. This is a focus on daily leadership. The question to ask is, what kind of leader does your organization or your team need you to be today? More emphasis on leadership, and my quick definition there is, I set the direction, other people figure out how to get us there. Management, where I set the direction and tell other people how to get us there. And doing, where I'm actually part of the team creating the results we're looking for. As leaders, all of us spend a certain percentage of our time in each of these three areas. The key is to identify how much of my time needs to be in each one of those key areas each individual day. I also use this as an assessment at the end of the day. I just take a look back at how my day went, how effective I thought I was. Did I get the results that I wanted or needed out of that day? And then look at what percentage of my time I spent in each of these key areas: lead, manage, and do. The great news is I've got a new choice the next day to take a look at how I'll use my time in a different way. One of the tools that I've found most effective to keep my organization aligned and delivering great results is a monthly letter. I call it the CEO Leadership Letter. And it's a simple document that goes out from me every single month. It's 4 short paragraphs, but the power of this tool can't be understated. Of all the tools that I've used, this is the one that I've heard people comment on the most about how positive an impact it's had on them. These simple 4 paragraphs hold us accountable for prior results, celebrate some people who have helped us deliver those results, and then talk about where we're headed next. And it looks something like this. Now, let me share a little secret. I'm going to show you a very simple formula and format to follow, but I want to admit, it didn't start out this way. I was in month 3 or 4 or 5 of writing these letters to my organization, and I was staring at a blank sheet of paper, thinking, what am I going to write about? Because at that point, I really thought I needed to turn out a literary masterpiece on leadership. That was when I developed this 4-paragraph formula I'll share with you today. And for the next 10 years, this is exactly the form these letters took. Now, to be honest, I thought it would be boring for people to read and maybe even boring for me to write. It was exactly the opposite. It made it infinitely easier for me to write. And people told me later, much easier for them to read. Hey, there's a reason the Wall Street Journal is arranged in a very specific format every day, to make it easier for us to read. Here's the format you can follow. Paragraph 1, well, that's last month. What did we expect to happen last month? What did we said we were going to accomplish, and what actually happened? You see, this holds us accountable for the commitments that we've made, the actions we've taken, and the results that we got. If this is all I wrote, it usually would be a significant advantage to most organizations. Look, I know when I was a CEO, at the end of the month, I was much more interested in what was going to happen next month than what happened last month. But the organization needs to know. They need to be held accountable for those results, and this paragraph does that. Paragraph 2, this is the superstar paragraph. This is where we find someone who delivered superstar results for us, and we tell that story. And that story sounds something like this. Here's who did it. Here's the results they got. And here's the important part of the story. Here's how they did it. Whenever I wrote that last part, how they did it, I reread it a couple of times because the message that I wanted to get across was, I wanted anyone to read it to be able to say, that's all they did? I could do that. That's what they did to achieve those results. I could do that also. Bring more people in to creating those great results. Paragraph 3, this is our values paragraph. This is where we find someone who acted in alignment with one of our core values, and we tell that story. The story sounds like this. Here's who did it. Here's what they did. And most importantly, here's why that was so important. I believe the values of your organization define your culture. More simply put, I think values are what we praise and what we punish. You do something inside of my value set, I'm going to say, great job, pat on the back, do more of that. You get outside of my value set, we're going to have a discussion, might get written up, might even get you dismissed. It's critical that as leaders in the organization, we reinforce these values with stories that illustrate to people what we mean by the way these values show up in our organization. And our fourth paragraph, this is next period, as in next period of time. So 8 times a year, that means next month. 4 times a year, I want to set quarterly outcomes. What's going to happen over the next 90 days? Give people a little longer timeline to accomplish big objectives. And then every month we'll fill in what happened after that. This simple 4-paragraph formula can be a great advantage to you, keeping your people more aligned and more engaged with the outcomes that you expect. Let's look at our next question. How am I doing? This is fundamentally a chance for people to understand what contribution they're making and if that contribution is valuable. I think the best tool here is a very simple coaching tool that has a big impact on the individuals inside your team, inside your organization. In fact, you may want to go along with me as I illustrate this. Think about a person in your group, on your team, that if they could really improve the results they deliver, the value that they add, their alignment with the organization, you'd be ecstatic, you'd be happy. And then take a look at this. In the first column, what are the 3 areas that if this person improved in these 3 areas, their results wouldn't just go up incrementally, they would go up exponentially. This would be a big leap for them. Lay out those 3 things. What are the 3 areas? If this person really improved in these 3 key areas, it would make a big difference. Next up, what's the plan of action? Specific and mutually agreed upon. Specific, probably self-explanatory. Mutually agreed upon means, I think if they do these things, it'll work. And they're saying, yes, I'm willing to do it. And then the last 2 columns go together. What are we going to measure? And by when, to see if these actions have created the right results? Have they improved? Have things gotten better? Now, the first time I ever used this tool, I was with a group of 16 CEOs. We did that first column together. They laid out the 3 things that this person that they had chosen could do to really improve. I asked them this question. Read over those 3 things and imagine that I was able to speak to that person later this afternoon. And I asked them the same question. I said, so what are the 3 things you're working on to really improve your performance this year? They're going to give me 3 things. I asked the group of CEOs, how close would they be to what you've laid out? Only about half the hands said they would be close. So for everybody who didn't raise their hand, the likelihood of change is really low. Then I said, of those who have their hands up, how many have a specific plan of action? I lost half the hands. Of the remaining hands, I said, okay, of those who have a plan of action, how many of you have specific measures and a date by which they're going to be measured? Just 1 hand left. And the group gave that little golf applause. And the guy said, I can't accept it. He said, the only reason I've got all this filled out is I told them that they didn't complete all these things and improve, we were going to have to let them go. And I see this all the time. The only time we go to this much detail with people is when we're on our last legs with them. I want you to turn that thinking around 180 degrees. I want you to call this a performance coaching tool. I want you to start with your top performers, walk them through it first. By the way, they love this stuff. Set around up for them how they're going to improve. Then work on your good performers, everybody whose current performance is within your expectations, and only then go to any low performers on your team. Nothing improved individual performance of my team members more than this tool, and it'll work for you also. Third question, how can we make things better around here? How can we make things better? We've got to engage people in this process of continuous improvement. Look, I wish I could tell you they ask this question this way, but the reality is they don't. They rarely ask how they can make things better. They give us ideas, suggestions, criticisms, even complaints. I'm telling you, it's just the only way they know to tell us they'd like for things to be different and better in the future than they are today. One way to do this is a little cheat sheet that I used to use with myself. I would have little sticky note reminders around my office on my phone that said W4C. This was shorthand for me for Walk the Four Corners. A simple reminder to get out and engage the people in my organization, those ones that do the work for us, the ones that make it all happen, to engage them and ask their thoughts about how we could do things better. Now look, I'm going to remind you of something that's going to sound pretty simple, but I promise you, I reminded myself every single time. I'm going to remind you now. Engage them personally first. And my cheat sheet for personal engagement, kids and hobbies. It's typically outside of work what people care about most. So I can engage one of my key people, someone who's really delivering the results at a grassroots level, and engage them personally. And then I can start to ask the questions I really want to ask. What is it that we could be doing better around here? What is it that you see from your spot in the organization about what we could do more of, less of, or differently that I would probably never see? What is it that you can see in the organization that could really change things around here? One of the companies I studied for my book, CEO Tools 2.0, I wanted to see how large a company used the exact same principles I was talking about for entrepreneurial companies. And I found one, Danaher, a $20 billion company with 26 different operating companies. They take this principle so far, they require each one of their supervisors every week to ask every person working for them this question. If our goal is for you to do your job better today than yesterday, better tomorrow than today, what will we have you do differently? What would we have you do differently? Those supervisors take all those answers, feed them up to their manager level, who sort them out and look for best practices, and then ask upper management to fund those best practices in the form of improved processes and systems that ultimately deliver reliable results over time. How well does it work for them? They've beat the S&P 500 20 out of 20 years in a row. That's pretty good. But I think one of the best operators of businesses out there is Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway. Danaher is one of only 5 companies in the world who've beat Berkshire's results 10 out of 10 years in a row. And they attribute all their success to the continuous improvement they've developed, getting feedback from the people who work for them. There's a famous story about the former CEO at GE, Jack Welch. Jack was in an appliance plant in Kentucky. They were trying to decide whether to even keep the plant open or not. And he's asking these same kinds of questions to a long-term employee. And the guy's giving him all these ideas. And Welch is all excited. He's got an assistant with him. He turns to the assistant, "Are you getting this stuff?" And the guy stops him mid-sentence and says, "Mr. Welch, you know what the shame of this is? For 30 years, you've paid me for my hands, and you could have had my brains for free." No one ever asked. No one ever asked. Let's just not be guilty of that. I want you to think about the people in your organization that really make it happen. How long have they been around? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, maybe more? See, if we don't ask, the signal we're sending, and I get these are subtle signals, but the signal we're sending is, you don't know anything that I don't already know. Pretty arrogant, right? The minute we start asking, people feel valued for what they know, not just for what they do. And when that happens, trust goes up. Walk the 4 corners. I think if you've got a virtual environment today, if your people are remote during this Corona situation, it's even more important to be checking in with them, connect personally, and then get feedback about what we could do more of or differently to make things better. I'm going to leave you with this last thought. The people who work with and for us are with us more hours every week than the people they say they love the most in the world, their friends and family. Factor out sleep and it's not even close. And sometimes they're wandering around and they're thinking, does anybody care? Does any of this matter? Does it even mean anything? When I hear big picture questions like that, I'm reminded of a book I particularly like called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's about his experiences during World War II in concentration camps. And he said, when we heard people questioning life like that, you could see it in their eyes. They'd lost hope. And once they'd lost hope, they'd be gone in a day or a week or so. I want to remind you that sometimes the best tool you have at your disposal is to instill hope in the people who work with and for you. Let them know that you care they work for you, that the work they do matters, and that it means something. It means something to you, to your customers, to their fellow employees. I hope in my short time with you this afternoon, I've been able to give you something that'll make a difference for you. If there's anything that I can do to help, I'm happy to. And thanks so much for your time and attention this afternoon.
Jim, thank you so much. Again, very insightful. And I think everyone that's attended this call is very lucky that they're going to get a handbook from you via email. So we'll definitely follow up with all the attendees on that as well. Randy, I wanted to bring you back on to see if there's anything you'd wanted to close out with.
Yeah, no, I just want to, man, thank you, Jim and Jeff. Really great content. I was jotting things down, Jim, as you were talking, and sending questions to Jeff as well. So thank you guys very much. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, and also to thank folks at TIE Atlanta for a really wonderful session.
Thanks, Randy. And I obviously there's still several people that are still on that haven't logged out fully yet. So I actually wanted to open up just to be mindful. If there's anyone that has to drop off, please go ahead. But if there's anyone that actually has any questions, we still have Jeff and Jim both online. So you can either raise your hand or type it into the chat and we'll ask it live. And I'll give anybody a few seconds to see if they want to type something into the chat, or you can just raise your hand and then we can allow you to talk so you can ask your question live. So you guys have two options. Going once, going twice. All right, looks like there is no questions, Jim and Jeff. Okay, actually we do have one. I know if I always like wait a little bit, there'll be some. Okay, Zahir, I'm gonna allow you to talk. You should be online. Just unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Yeah, I really appreciate both presentations. They were awesome. On the last manufacturing numbers, I saw 95 on the China index, which I thought was really high. I was just curious if that was before or after tariffs.
That should be an after tariff, that should be a before tariff number. You know, it's not the same across all geographies and across all industries. Boston Consulting Group has not been very transparent about how they create that index. I will tell you, so we don't, know all the components of it. I will tell you something that I thought was very interesting about that index was it's shown China becoming progressively less cheap over many years. Every year that number went from, I don't know where it was at 1.60, and back in 2017, I think it was, it looked like the U.S. and China were at parity for all-in manufacturing costs, or it was just a tad below parity. And then the next year, it should have shown that the U.S. was more competitive than China. Boston Consulting Group didn't publish the index that year and stopped publishing it. And now that China is cheaper again, it's published again. I don't know if that's coincidence or has to do with where consulting contracts come from. But and what we're hearing is that there's a lot of issues. Increasing issues with quality control with China. That was the old problem with China. It's starting to happen again as some of the you no longer have as wide an opportunity to source from there. So and then there's this nagging thought in everyone's mind that either there's tariffs coming or there's some kind of regulatory incentives coming to move sourcing away from China. So I don't think it has to be at cost parity to drive this trend. That would help, of course, but you can see some of that even without cost parity.
Thanks, Jerry. I hope that answered your question.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and Jim, we got one in the chat that came for you. So Paul Lopez is asking, Jim, what changes, if any, should a department head make to outline your CEO monthly leadership letter, frequency outline, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, Paul. You know, I think the nice thing about a lot of these tools is they scale. I've used them as the head of an organization, like the CEO, and I've used them when I was a head of a department as well. I don't think you change it much. It's just more specific to the goals and outcomes that your department has committed to. And I would review those in the last month, find a superstar from your team. By the way, you could always add someone from the organization who had assisted your team as well on the superstar. Values, I definitely would find someone on my own team if possible. And then where you're headed next, I would say that would be specific to the goals, outcomes, and deliverables that your department is responsible for. Now, obviously, those are best when they tie into the overall organization, and I'm sure you would have it do that, but just make it more department specific. I actually think it's a very powerful tool to have your department operate at an optimum level.
Thanks, Jim. Paul, hopefully that answered your question. If there's anything that you want to follow up with, please do type it in. Gonna ask again, if there's anyone that does want to ask any questions, you can either send it through the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you or allow you to speak. Give it couple more seconds. All right, so Paul said all good, thanks. All right, I guess we'll go ahead and close out. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. And again, we will be sending